Welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm David Gartenstein-Ross from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. With me is Dan Drezner, who's a professor at the Fletcher School. He is on loan right now from Dresbert, so Dresbert fans, don't worry, it hasn't been replaced by Drezner-Ross. Now, Dan, we're here to talk about Trump, liberal academia, and all that other good stuff. There recently was an op-ed piece by Nick Kristof called "The Dangers of Echo Chambers on Campus." It was one you had a few objections to, which started a discussion, which, as all good discussions do, boiled its way on over into blogging heads. So why don't you start us off by telling us where Kristof is wrong?
Sure. Well, actually, I want to start by talking where I think Kristof is right, because I don't always agree with Nick Kristof when it comes to his takes on the academy. And so when I saw this column, I was like, oh, God, I'm going to have to read this too. Because, he tends to... Kristof does something that I think a lot of columnists who write about higher ed do, which is they tend to focus on the elite institutions and then generalize from whatever you see at places like Yale or Harvard or what have you and assume this is what ails higher education writ large. In the case of this column, however, Kristof is arguing that one of the problems with the academy is the increasing political homogeneity on campus, which is to say that campus professors, by and large, are almost overwhelmingly liberal. As a result, students who attend universities at these places tend to be ensconced in this kind of liberal cocoon, which leads them to have a failure of recognition that there, A, might be a diversity of political opinions out there, and B, might be a diversity of Americans that are not necessarily represented on campus. And this helps to explain, according to Kristof, the degree of campus shock, for lack of a better way of putting it, following Trump's victory in the Electoral College and in the election after November. This is the point where I actually have to say I think, by and large, Kristof is correct in identifying the issue of liberal homogeneity on elite campuses. The data on this is pretty incontrovertible, whether you look at UCLA has a higher education survey, a site called Heterodox Academy has taken this data and shows overwhelmingly that not only are academics pretty much strongly liberal, they've actually gotten more liberal or moved further to the left in the last 20 years. That is, I'm just stipulating that fact. I don't disagree with Kristof on that. Where I do disagree with Kristof is taking the 2016 election as an example of cocooning in the academy for a variety of reasons. But the most prominent of which is, I don't deny that there are obviously partisan splits, when it comes to presidential politics, and I don't deny that, in previous election rounds, you had liberal academics railing against Mitt Romney or John McCain or George W. Bush or what have you. What made 2016 unique, I would argue, however, is that throughout the campaign, the one component of the sort of conservative movement / GOP movement that never warmed to Trump in any way whatsoever was, in fact, the intelligentsia, for lack of a better way of putting it, which included conservative columnists, conservatives who were located at think tanks, and conservatives in the academy. They might be small, but they certainly exist. One can point to a few examples of sort of conservative intellectuals for Trump. I believe there's a website that I can't remember the name of it now, but basically academics for Trump or intellectuals for Trump. Mark Bauerlein, maybe at Emory, might be the most prominent example of this. But the truth is that there were also petitions for conservatives against Trump, and those petitions actually got a larger set of numbers. And so I would suggest that students that were, who take intellectuals pretty seriously, if you're presumably at a highfalutin university, if you read what both conservative intellectuals and liberal intellectuals are saying, and they all are sort of universally against the GOP nominee, that might cause a slightly different kind of reaction than if you had the sort of traditional partisan splits, which you would have had in 2008 or 2012.
Yeah.
And so I don't mean to deny that there is an issue involving liberals on campus, although I also don't think it's quite as overblown as Kristof thinks. What I do think, though, more importantly, is that the 2016 election is a bad case to point to as supporting evidence for this.
Yeah, and I agree with that critique overall. When you think about the hook that Kristof used, I think it's a bad hook, though actually the 2016 election could be a really good hook. He just doesn't quite realize what he could have done with it. Right. So Kristof actually wrote a column which is almost identical about 6 months ago or so.
Yes.
Talking about echo chambers on campus. And look, in both cases, I think that it's a discussion that should be had. I encourage that discussion. I think both of them, especially, for Kristof, it seems to be something that he's somewhat newly thinking about, the way that he himself might be a part of an echo chamber. And I certainly applaud that kind of self-introspection. Neither of them, I feel, completely nail the issue, though I like to see the fact that discussion is happening in the New York Times. I think the reason it's a bad hook is exactly what you articulate, which is that saying that there is shock on campuses in 2016, and that shows how these are echo chambers, is, I think, just not accurate. As you said, not only did you have a lot of conservatives oppose, but also this was an election that uniquely got into some areas which have tended to be red lines that you wouldn't cross in U.S. politics. You have a lot of foreign students, for example, on college campuses who feel that they themselves are kind of somewhat personally attacked during the course of the election. Now, I think the way that it could have been a very good hook is that uniquely 2016 put its finger on a deep divide within American society between and one could slice this in a number of different ways, but for lack of a better term, it's kind of the elite populist divide. And there,
no, I think 538 had a piece demonstrating that education was the single most important cleavage that you could use to explain sort of voting patterns in 2016.
Yeah, and so therefore, for higher education to be dumbfounded by what occurred actually does show in a significant way a blind spot. The blind spot it shows, I think, is people who are associated with higher education institutions who help to shape a generation coming through it, not even understanding the parts of the country that don't connect to that, and how they're perceived nationally. When you don't have a good read on the pulse of the country, and when you yourself are one of those big dividing institutions, I think that does point to a remarkable blind spot. So I think he could have flipped it a little bit and actually had a very good hook connected to the 2016 election, but that would have taken some finessing, and he went with the obvious hook, and it wasn't a very good hook, but he put his finger on what I think is a real issue, which is that of echo chambers. I want to turn to one thing that you said, which is you think the issue's overblown a little bit. Is that because, as you'd said at the outset, that it's focused on elite institutions as opposed to kind of other four-year and other higher educational institutions?
So this is part of a larger debate that in some ways I've been having, and part of I'm going to be talking about this in a book that's coming out in April called The Ideas Industry, which is it's amazing you brought that up, so I could bring that up. But which is to say, again, I do not deny that there is an overwhelmingly liberal bias among professors, particularly at elite institutions. Do I think that is an issue worthy of debate? Yes. Do I think that is an automatic indictment of the way in which universities are run? This is where I begin to have some issues. And the parallel I always make, and you're welcome to push back on this, is that, academics are like doctors, like lawyers, like others. It's a profession, which means that even if your political biases within that group, that doesn't necessarily mean that one of the points of being a professional is the notion that you were able to somehow excise those political beliefs from, let's say, how you deal with things in the classroom, or potentially how you conduct your research. So what I would say is a few things on this. The first is, I don't think that just because academics are overwhelmingly liberal, therefore political indoctrination is taking place on college campuses. I find that massively overblown. And there will be examples we can talk about, but I often find that those examples largely exist outside of the classroom as opposed to inside of the classroom. The second issue, and this is a tick I have, which is that, again, as I said, when Kristof and others write about this, their overwhelming focus tends to be on elite institutions. And I'll certainly concede that those are important institutions, but it overlooks the sort of greater degree of diversity that you have at, frankly, the campuses that educate an awful damn lot of Americans, which are the state schools sprinkled throughout the 50 states. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. And I think the third thing, and this is where I am genuinely concerned about the marginalization of academics in the wider sort of marketplace of ideas, which is to say, again, I don't deny that the painting of academics as liberals on the whole is by and large accurate. What I don't like about that is that it is a quick and easy way to automatically dismiss anything that an academic says that might be pertinent to a public policy debate. And that in part reflects nothing so much on bad academics, but rather the sort of polarized times we live in, which is to say that if someone says something, let's say a Harvard professor comes out saying, Donald Trump's trade policies will wreck the U.S. economy as we know it, someone is able to say, oh, well, that's just a typical Harvard academic making that point. It's a cheap, by and large, contentless criticism that will nonetheless play well with half the country. And I don't like the fact that that works. But on the other hand, you can argue that, in some ways, liberals are potentially able to do that with certain forms of conservative critique. So I don't mean to suggest that is unique it's a unique vulnerability that academics have.
Yeah, so, the state schools point, I think, is an interesting one. And I haven't been able to, I haven't had the time to parse out the data on this. Obviously, elite schools are more liberal than state schools are. But looking at kind of the data on higher education as a whole, it certainly seems that even at state schools, you're going to have a significant skew over to the left, though less pronounced. So there's more diversity, but it's still not what I'd describe as anything like intellectual diversity, certainly not to the same extent as the country as a whole. Mm-hmm. About professionals, I think it's an interesting point, and you and I initially discussed this cued to one of the pieces you'd written comparing political bias in academia to political bias in the military. I think one of the deep my point, and then you can push back on it, which is my argument is that if you look at the military has a conservative, bias, at least among the officer corps. And again, I don't necessarily have an issue with that because it doesn't necessarily affect how they do their jobs. Sorry, go ahead. Right. And so I think one kind of important dividing line is, for a doctor or for a lawyer, you understand how you can evaluate whether they're doing their job. I think it's a bit more amorphous in the case of academia. That's not to say that there aren't objective metrics. It's just a little bit more difficult to determine. So you had, for example, the controversy over could you evaluate people's scholarship based on kind of the citation numerical rankings. And Georgetown, which I teach at, recently did away with that. I think that was probably the right move.
I didn't know that. That's
interesting. To move away from that as a particular metric. But it's more like it's somewhat more difficult to evaluate a good academic, in my view, versus, say, a good doctor or a good lawyer. And you're pondering that point, so I'm sure we can get back to that. Yeah. But the second thing is, or the final point I'd make there is, with respect to intellectual diversity, you pointed to how people can, in turn, bat back at how liberals might dismiss conservative viewpoints in the same way, and that does occur, including on college campuses. I wonder if, to me, it seems like kind of the rejection or the suspicions of academia is kind of consonant with the way in which academia tends to, like the view that it tends to have of kind of non-educated middle Americans. It seems like there's kind of views that are somewhat consonant with each other there.
No, I want to push back on this for a few things. First, and this gets to the distinction perhaps between what we would consider conservatism as you and I understand it, prior to 2016, and I don't deny that liberal academics will often, a lot of them will stereotype conservatives, but I do think that academics who take, let's say, political theory seriously or take politics seriously or so on and so forth, a lot of them do understand, I think, this sort of rich tradition of conservative thought. They might have issues with it, but they can also usually engage with it. The distinction with 2016 is not so much, I think, with conservatism, it's with populism. And there's an important distinction to be made here, because you can argue that there was a strong streak of conservative thought that was actually extremely elitist, among other things. But even the sort of traditional conservatism that wasn't elitist, nonetheless took liberal ideas seriously and wanted a genuine sort of sustained intellectual engagement on debates about policy. That is pretty much the opposite of what populism articulates. And this is the one element where I do think the Academy was sort of, was paying attention to sort of undercurrents in 2016. And as I think I said, I taught global political economy this past fall, and my students thought I was really, really prescient because the last session I had was on political populism or populist nationalism in a globalized economy. So it looked at the degree to which, you were seeing voter sentiments shift because of populism. And just to be clear, when I say populism, I'm usually meaning, the standard definition implies that a populist sentiment might be right-leaning, it might be left-leaning in terms of the Bernie Sanders crowd, for example. But what it usually tends to do is revolt against or reject elite consensus, in the belief that elites have basically stacked the deck against the common man, and therefore the system as we know it needs to be totally and thoroughly reformed. Now, one can substantively engage in that kind of question about whether or not the system is stacked against the little guy. And I would argue, frankly, a lot of left academics, not liberal, left academics would probably agree with that. The problem is that, academics, by definition, occupy the elite positions that populists just, loathe anyway. So, as a result, it's hard to engage in that kind of conversation, I think, because essentially the people that you're talking to don't, think you're trying to delegitimize them from the get-go, and that makes it problematic. And to some extent, I think it works vice versa. There was a great Harvard Business Review article that came out, I think, within the first month after the election, pointing out the degree to which populists right now that supported Trump, by and large, the distinction between left populists and right populists is that left populists don't like billionaires. Billionaires are the enemy of left populists. For right populists, it's people like you and me.
But only some billionaires, right?
Right. I'm not
ridiculousness of Bernie Sanders.
Right. Yeah.
He was campaigning about how GE was ruining America and talking about that, and then he's asked, "Well, is Apple ruining America?" He's like, "Oh no, not Apple." Yeah, because Apple is cool, and like all the people who vote Sanders have their iPhones, but like Apple at the end of the day is the richest corporation in the world, and it has all these offshore tax havens that like GE can never dream of. But Bernie Sanders won't criticize them because it's super stylish to be pro-Apple, whereas GE is that kind of old school, pro-capitalist institution that is wrapped up in the Cold War, where he was, on the side of the Sandinistas and the like. And so, of course, he's going to criticize GE. I mean, it's just like stupid. But I think this actually kind of, to me, speaks to one of the things that, like, if you're to look at in terms of kind of general schemas, the Sanders populism is thought of as being kind of stylish, avant-garde, maybe even very smart. With at least that's the way I see.
No, I think you're right.
Yeah,
I despise both forms of populism. So go ahead. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, but both of them. Both of them have their intellectual issues.
Yeah.
But within academia, the Trump populism is toxic, and the Sanders populism is heroic. And I mean, that's a problem. I mean, that to me speaks to a problem with academia not really, like, in my view, making as much of an effort. And I mean, look, I think maybe my critique's a little bit unfair in that it's populism being read in part by people who aren't necessarily studying politics, right?
Right. So this is
for a
another
political scientist, I would want them to get it right. But like when you're looking at people who are part of the arts, they're going to have political opinions like someone else. But I don't necessarily expect just because someone's an academic if they're teaching in, say, the music department, that they'll have as sophisticated thoughts about politics as I do.
Right. So, I mean, again, the way I would, and this again is an issue I have occasionally with sort of Kristof and the general critique of the Academy's musings, which is I would argue the social sciences do in fact are paying close attention to these kinds of trends and doing so in an analytical way. Again, there's been a series of interesting papers written, and there will be more of them written about whether or not basically populism in both Europe and the United States is being driven by economic anxiety and economic resentments, or is it being driven by cultural issues in the sense of hostility to immigration or what have you. And I think by and large, you're going to see that debate continue within the Academy, and that's a worthwhile debate to have. And I think also it implies that social scientists are going to engage in the kind of analysis that you want on Trump voters and what have you. Then you've got to talk about the sort of humanities people that, they're going to have political opinions, and I'm sure a lot of those political opinions will look cartoonish to, someone in, is it Waukesha County? I can never remember if I pronounced that correctly. The one that Dave Weigel always makes fun of. It'll come down to crucial Waukesha County, I think. No,
I actually have to admit I've never seen the Weigel jokes there. So
never mind. Okay. But the point is, the heart of the industrial Midwest, that those kinds of academics are going to make statements that are easy to lampoon. But on the other hand, I don't know if they're going to make them in the classroom. And if they don't make them in the classroom, then it's hard for me to care about them in the same way as saying it's like rotting, students' brains. Although that goes to a separate issue, which is more problematic, I think, which is the fact that increasingly it's hard to separate academics' private political opinions from their sort of professional life as an academic. And this is a problem that journalists, I think, face. It's a problem that anyone with a public profile faces, which is it used to be the case that you could, go into a classroom, express your, teach what you want. Then outside, maybe you would write an op-ed, maybe you would write something else, but that didn't necessarily circulate. It wouldn't have caused, someone would have had to go out of their way to find that you wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times or something like that. The problem with the web now, and the problem with social media, is that those things rocket around very, very quickly.
Right.
And so as a result, it becomes, to use a Seinfeldianism, it's a worlds colliding issue where there's, academic Dan versus political Dan or whatever, pundit Dan, or, so on and so forth. And I've said this many times, excuse me, it's a tension that I have yet to resolve. I don't quite know how to deal with that. But yeah, I would agree with you that you have to separate what, the sort of academic analyses of trends that lead to Donald Trump or Brexit or Marine Le Pen or what have you versus the sort of political, quick hot take by an art history professor that doesn't really thought that deeply about it.
Yeah, but I think that regardless, it seems to me that fairly clear that academia is becoming less free over time and more hostile to views that fall outside of kind of the liberal box that defines it.
Okay,
and
so let me hold on, because I forgot. I rambled long enough that I forgot your original point, which is about left populist versus right populist. I'm sorry about that. I would say the difference between the two of them, and if there is one evident political bias that the Academy has, it's that it's not so much on economic, it's not economic issues, but it is on social issues. There is a general bias towards tolerance, of minorities or what have you within the Academy. And the one thing that Bernie Sanders' version of populism has to it, although obviously he clashed with Black Lives Matter and what have you, was this notion of he's not a racist and, he certainly disavowed that. With Trump, if I'm supposed to take him substantively but not literally, I don't care what he actually says in terms of denials about his attitudes about minorities. We all know exactly what he was saying in a variety of his sentiments. And so it's tougher, I think, for the Academy to accept people that do articulate a belief that too much cultural or racial mixing is bad, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very legitimate distinction, and one I wouldn't argue with. I mean, I think that it's there, it's factually there. I wouldn't, though, describe the bias of academia as being necessarily anti-intolerance. So one thing the Kristof column speaks about is actually a very active kind of intolerance against evangelical Christians. Right? He points to polls. And he didn't state what the polls were, which departments they were talking about, but certain areas in which you have a large amount of people say that they would discriminate against evangelicals in terms of hiring process. And so I understand kind of what the argument would be there. Like you could look at evangelical views on homosexuality or gay marriage or whatever. But how would that be kind of a distinction between, say, an evangelical and a practicing Sunni Muslim, right? Why would it be that it's okay to discriminate against an evangelical and not a practicing Sunni Muslim? I mean, you start to get into some hard ground there almost right away. And I think right now, also the constructs as to where intolerance lies, I think are very strange constructs, which are defined by, where we are at this point in 2016, and they're not going to be the same as they are in about 5 to 10 years. I mean, so one of the things I'm studying right now, spending time looking at, is the impact of internet penetration on Middle Eastern and African societies. And I think that LGBT identity is going to be an issue in these areas in a way that it just hasn't been, almost entirely attributable to the fact that people are coming online. And the other thing that's going to be a big dividing line is atheism. As atheism becomes a dividing line in some of these areas, you're suddenly going to have a much more different aperture of a debate about extant religion than you've had before, including debates about Islam and the like. So right now within academia, someone like an Ayaan Hirsi Ali is thought of as being this bigoted figure, which I think is probably under theorized in terms of looking at it. I mean, anytime you're getting,
but there's a debate that should perhaps be had about her view. There's a debate that should be had about her views. For like,
I mean, I'm not weighing in as to how she should be viewed. I would just say that when you have a society which is very religious and becoming less so, you're going to get a certain different tone of debate when suddenly this is opened up. And this has been true of Christianity, right? When it's debates about Christianity, we don't really bat an eye because we're used to that. But when you're talking about something like Islam, it's a religion that has 1.6 billion people, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, you're going to get some debates that to us today look as though, oh my God, they're terrible. But that's what happens when you get this opening up. So the aperture is going to change. And just like the aperture about debates about Christianity or the place of Christianity in society has changed as well. And so I think we have a very 2016 bound view of what constitutes intolerance of intolerance. And so in the case of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example, what I'd say is I think there probably should be a place for people to go from being believing Muslims to being atheists, and there's going to be certain sets of debates about the role of religion, and obviously one could argue she crossed the line in any one of a number of ways. I'm not saying those are illegitimate debates. I just think there's kind of this automatic interpretation that we have based upon the fact really that academia just doesn't take religion very seriously. And so any debates about religion that might cast religions as being different from each other are going to tend to be areas in which one thinks that there's hot water, and that may be unfair.
That's true. I would go back to your earlier point about Kristof's column about discriminating against evangelicals and so on and so forth. First of all, I really want to look at the data on that, because this is one of those things where, he says that I want to. It's a story. I vaguely recall that data point, but I also vaguely recall that was a contested data point.
Right.
The other thing I would point out, by the way, as someone who has just undergone anti-discrimination training as part of the Fletcher School, is that that's illegal. Yeah. You can't do that. You're not allowed to discriminate in terms of hiring based on religious beliefs. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but in fact, it was drilled into me. I can't do that. if I'm supposed to be on a search committee and that were to come up, although I don't know how the hell that comes up. So, in that sense, in theory, the law should protect those kinds of religious groups against that kind of discrimination, which is not to say that the law is perfect or that people don't have prejudice in their hearts, whichever way. But I just want to point out that legally we can't, no one is, academics can't do that.
Correct. And I think where it would come up, you answered that earlier on when you talked about how there's not really the separation from professional and private lives there used to be, right? That's, it's much easier than ever before to understand if someone's religious, what religion they subscribe to, what their view of that religion is, if they've been, open about it in any way, you can find out that information.
No, that's certainly true. Although, there's one of the interesting questions that will happen as a result of Trump's victory is whether you will start seeing, at least in social science departments, a push towards not political diversity is not the way I would put it, but rather, at a minimum, are you going to want to hire people who want to study this phenomenon? People like, I can't remember the name of the author, the one who went down to Louisiana to study the, it was part of the J.D. Vance Hillbilly elegy. There were a couple of books that came out.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? The more academic anthropological books of, I went to this county to study white working class, attitudes about X. So, in that sense, it's an interesting question about whether or not you're going to try to bring in people that are better tuned to that segment of the population. Although there is also a part of me that just wants to point out that I don't think we really suffered in 2016 from a deficit of newspaper and or magazine portrayals of the Trump voter. I'm just going to go out on a limb there and suggest that they covered the hell out of this. To the point where there was actually a satirical piece, I can't remember where it came out, on this, the pointing out this was a genre. Now, maybe you can say the coverage wasn't good, or maybe
I would certainly say that.
You could argue the coverage was stereotypical. I'm not sure I entirely buy that. I think some of them were stereotypical. I think some of them weren't. I think Selena Zito's, for example, coverage was quite sympathetic. I think Byron York, did yeoman work in terms of taking Trump seriously and literally, actually, in his sense. And I think there were liberal, journalists who also did this kind of analysis, pointing out, a variety of things. The question is whether it'll now filter up into the academy, I guess.
Yeah, I think the bottom line, and I started to say this before, is that, I think the academy is best off when it's able to grapple with the truth of subjects. I think that should be uncontroversial, although I'm sure there's someone who can disagree with it. But it's better off the more you maximize freedom, such that you're actually able to approach things as an academic should. Right. I think that the academy has become less free for a variety of reasons, including the swing in power away from professors, which mean the reduction in job security, all of which makes people who are academics a little bit more contingent. Their positions are much more contingent than they used to be, so it's at times I wonder when it comes to kind of the academy, how deep their understanding of something like a Trump voter could be. And look, as you said. With respect to the genre of writings, agonizing about this strange beast of the Trump voter, some of the writing was quite good, some of it was bad. Just like within academia, I'm sure you'll have some good and some bad understandings. Yeah. But my concern overall with respect to academia. Is that it certainly we can see areas in which the political biases within academia have an impact of what people are exposed to. before you and I had a conversation previously that about this, where one thing you had pointed to was campus speaking.
And I just want to point out the system ate that video. Okay, it is a rigged system. That was a great conversation, and yet someone did not want people to hear that conversation.
Yeah, it ended me in tears, conceding. Dan, you bested me. You pointed to campus speakers as one example of where you're more likely to see, conservative voices, not be heard. I think that is one kind of legitimate example, though, as you said, that's not in the classroom. That's external to the classroom. I'm not sure. I mean, I've wrestled a little bit with the question of politics within the classroom. I mean, my own experiences, as a student and to some extent as a professor, indicate that that politics do make their way into the classroom. I'm not sure how I would kind of empirically measure out your statement, in that obviously you have your experiences as a student, you have your experiences as a professor. In fact, like, your direct experiences are certainly far more voluminous than mine. Given that teaching is just something that I do on the side. Right. So I've thought about it. I don't think there's any kind of empirical way to measure it out other than to say, oh, I've seen it, but that doesn't really, that doesn't answer the question in any way, shape, or form. But it's interesting. So before this Blogging Heads, I reread Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. One thing that I think is very interesting, looking back on it, it was written in 1987, so as of next year, it'll be 30 years old. And the trends that Alan Bloom was putting his finger on, from the rise of relativism to a closing aperture of ideas, I think have certainly accelerated over time. And for Bloom, this is a matter of deep concern. Right, he says essentially that because his views are going to be colored by the fact that he was a lifelong professor, but his own view is that given that academia is the halls of learning, there's almost no crisis as profound that a society could face as a crisis of academia. That's the way he framed it towards the beginning of the book. But I think that he is on to something, in the sense that especially the elite institutions, and as we talked about, the elite institutions have a different viewpoint, a different set of problems than, say, state institutions. But ultimately, it's Yale and Harvard and other kind of elite institutions which really are producing the generation of people who are going to be shaping our politics and shaping our society in ways that people at state institutions couldn't dream of doing. When they're narrowed down to kind of a single viewpoint, which is very much which is a very bounded viewpoint, but views itself as being kind of this objective truth, I think that's a problem. And that connects itself to the broader divide that was brought out during the course of the 2016 election.
So, okay, a couple of things here. The first is that when we talk about the sort of, let's be clear, the factors affecting the academy in terms of its ability to promote open debate, and I think we're in agreement on this, don't have as much to do with sort of polarization of political views within the academy, but rather sort of economic factors that have altered the way in which the academy is run, which is namely, as tuition has gone up, particularly at the elite institutions that are the concern of this conversation, the problem is that universities have stopped viewing students as students and started viewing students as customers. And the moment you make that distinction of wanting to please the student, suddenly your ability to, potentially intellectually discipline them or intellectually, try to educate them becomes a little more challenging. And this goes to the issue also of the sort of adjunctification of the academy, in which I, as a full professor, do have, without question, I think, a greater degree of autonomy. If I run afoul of, if I offend a student's sensibilities, I say this at the beginning of every graduate class, which is, say, if I, say something that requires a trigger warning or offends your sensibilities, I truly don't give a shit. Because we're in grad school and your core beliefs should be challenged at least once or twice before you get out of here. And if people have a problem with me saying that or other things that I say in the classroom, they can complain and it usually doesn't matter that much. because in the context, it's understood that I'm doing this for pedagogical reasons, and I'm a full professor, which means I feel secure. If I'm an adjunct, or I'm a visiting professor, or even if I'm tenure track, suddenly you have to care about things like, I don't know, student evaluations, which if we want to talk, by the way, about bad metrics for how to measure an academy, I will take citation metrics on research way more than I will take student evaluations for a variety of reasons. And the problem is that we don't even have anything better, which is which is certainly the issue. On the question of sort of Bloom and the concern about, for lack of a better way of putting it, a failure to pay attention to the truth in the academy, I would argue one of the more disturbing trends going forward is actually the degree to which the sort of postmodern attitudes about, well, what is really truth at this point, is no longer a province of the sort of left academy and the humanities, but rather now seems to be the province of the Trump political team, which is to say that it doesn't really matter. We had Anthony Scaramucci, say this week that, don't take Trump literally, take him symbolically. I'm not, he actually said that. Newt Gingrich during the campaign, was bringing up voter fraud or I can't remember what issue, and he was, the CNN reporter said, this is just not true. And Gingrich said, it doesn't matter whether it's not true. If people feel like it's true, if voters think like it's true, then then it matters. That's a terrifying statement if you think about it, which is to say that if it turns out that basically the very people that decry, relativism in the academy are going to embrace relativism in politics, then Bloom was foreshadowing, larger issues about the way in which the academy influences the larger debate. But it'll be a cruel irony to most of the academy if it turns out that it is the Trump White House that winds up being the most, refined articulation of these kinds of approaches to truth.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of, I think there's a dialogic process at play. I mean, we can see this, with respect to fake news, for example, where, I think fake news is legitimately alarming. I don't actually have a question about that. I guess the most alarming thing is people's, basic inability to determine that, like, this, crude sensationalistic drivel of, Hillary sex rings and whatnot are, pedophile rings or are not actually kind of well supported by fact. But, the response, which I think there is legitimacy to, from, some, conservatives who, so for example, I was just on a talk radio show before this with some conservative hosts in Minneapolis, and their kind of consideration, their counter to the coverage of fake news is, well, within the mainstream media, you have a bound-up viewpoint which often gets things wrong, in part because of its biases. I think there's legitimacy to that. It's legitimacy which results in people not taking, the issue of fake news as seriously as they should. But it's something which starts with, well, here's a problem in terms of the way coverage is done, which does result in getting things wrong. And I could point to lots of viewpoint-specific areas where the mainstream media just gets things wrong, in part because it sees its view as being so normative. It doesn't justify fake news, but I think it does help to put its finger on a dialogic process. Now, of course, if the dialogic process is, postmodern academy having an impact on kind of the Trump team's relationship to truth, that would be a truly wicked and unexpected dialogic process to occur.
This actually happened. So I think there was a New Yorker profile back in October, and I want to say the guy's like, is it Mike Cernovich? Where he actually says, I went to college, I read Lacan. What we need to do is promote our own narratives. And it's a surprising statement, and he actually knows that it's a surprising statement that he's going to take. But again, it's very consistent with the appropriation of the sort of postmodern approach to truth. Yeah, which is a disturbing thing. On the mainstream media being biased, I would argue There's two kinds of biases, and one I would agree with you and one I would push back on. The first kind of bias is if you cover a story, does your political bias or political leanings infect how you report that story, given that whatever the story is? I don't deny that occurs, but I also don't think it's quite as prevalent as conservative critics of the mainstream media would like to point out. And by the way, it's also worth pointing out the degree to which you are increasingly seeing conservatives, you are seeing a migration from like the conservative press into the mainstream media.
Absolutely.
And I think that needs to be acknowledged. The place where I do think there is bias, and in some ways it actually does tie back into our conversation about the Academy, is where I do think there's bias is in picking which stories you think are important. It's the agenda setting aspect of it. So in much the same way that academics will research questions that they think are important to them in a normative way, presumably, journalists or editors are going to think, well, this is something worth studying. I think this is something worth focusing on. Now, there's limits to that, particularly on the journalism side, in a way that I don't think there is on the academic side, which is to say, again, the Cambrian explosion of Trump voter profiles that we've experienced over the last 12 months. And so I think as a result, it is safe to say that the mainstream media is going to be on the Trump voter beat for the next 4 years. The question is whether, how those stories are framed and whether political biases wind up affecting those kinds of stories. There, I do think, I guess the way I would put it is that the problem I have with this going forward is that it is too easy to point to one or two examples of stereotypically bad stories and say, see, I don't need to pay attention to the whole mainstream media. Look at that bad example. In the same way that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Federalist had a story, or had a story this week, and I like the Federalist as a source of interesting conservative opinion. But the Federalist had a story this week about how Rogue One shows that the founders were right about slavery. No, I'm not making it up. That was literally something like the headline. Using Galen Erso's, collaboration with the Empire as an example. But that's not the issue. The issue is it was very easy to mock because the headline just everyone had the same reaction you did. And it'll therefore be easy to say, oh, we shouldn't read the Federalist. The Federalist has nothing of value, which is not true. Like all outlets, regardless of political affiliation, by and large, there's occasionally good things and occasionally bad things. It's usually mostly good things, but the problem is I will admit my one concern is that we all have enough biases so that the bad stories we want to believe in, the things that demonstrate, our low opinion of whatever institution we're talking about, are the things we're going to pay the most attention to.
Yeah. I think one of the overall problems we have coming out of 2016 is, in terms of our institutions, I think we're trapped in what one could describe as a vicious cycle, where 2016 was not a particularly strong year politically. This is apart from the election results. What I mean is it was a viciously divided year. One which saw the breakdown of multiple institutions, lots of distrust brought to the fore, and much worse beyond that, rioting, and just like an awful political year.
And by the way, it unlike most presidential transition years, it's not gotten better. I mean, in previous transition years, usually there was at least some bounce for the candidate that won. There has been much less of a bounce for Donald Trump this time around.
Yeah, so I mean, the question really, I think, is how to, as a citizen, how do we work to break out of this vicious cycle? In pointing to academia, obviously I don't hate academia. I've taught at multiple universities. This was my last semester teaching, at least for a while, but that's just due to time considerations. Right. But I think academia is valuable as an institution. I feel like it has its blind spots, and sure. To me, the inclusion of conservative viewpoints isn't so much a moralistic concern. I don't feel that it's. I feel instead that it's a functional concern. That when you have viewpoints that are important to understand that aren't represented or are shunned, it makes the institution of academia less good at understanding the world, which ultimately is what academia is trying to do. So, look, I do like the fact, Dan, that your view of academia is a more optimistic view than mine. As I said before, you have more experience with academic institutions than I do, though I have plenty of experience with them. But as someone who's teaching full time and you're getting you have quite a fire hose to draw from. Though I think probably the Fletcher School is actually a little bit unique in that it's so professionalized as a school that it would look that I think it's possible that your view would be different if you were at a liberal arts institution full time, for example, at this point.
And I've had my own idiosyncratic academic experiences as well. I guess we're getting to the point where we should probably wrap up. I would close with this thought, though, which is to say, I think you're right. Academic, the greatest contribution academics can make to the public sphere, as it were, is if they bring up new and important truths that previously heretofore had not been recognized. What I would suggest, however, and I don't deny that at this point it is likely that those truths that are then put forward might be biased more towards the left than the right. So it would be good if you had academics who might have certain liberal shibboleths or leftist shibboleths have to deal with, contrary points of view to figure out whether or not to stress test their own ideas. That said, I am also going to go out on a limb and say every once in a while it is possible that the truth that an academic comes up with is in fact on the left side of the spectrum, and in fact might even be on the far left side of the spectrum. And my concern then is what happens if the academic tries to say, look, I've got ironclad evidence that this phenomenon is happening. And the way in which the political, discourse of this country is set is that it is extremely easy to marginalize that argument by saying you're just a typical lefty academic. And that's in some ways the real fear I have when it comes to the impact of academics on society, which is to say, by the way, I'm not all that far left. I hope that's not the case all that much. I have motivated biases in that sense. But it is going to happen every once in a while. Just as it might be the case that conservative, opinions on something turn out to be true. And so, as much as I think the academy obviously has to look inward in terms of figuring out whether or not it's promoting an open debate, what I am worried about is the way in which academics are perceived by the Kristofs or the George Wills of the world as being these, this monoculture that doesn't produce anything new or interesting. Because I also don't think that's true either. Right.
So, if you look at another maligned class, it's the one that both Kristof and George Will belong to, the pundit class. So it's in 2016, it's not as though there are many viewpoints which don't have somebody trying to delegitimize it just by virtue of the politics of the viewpoint, and that's something which I think we can agree there should be less of. I mean, truth can come from all, nobody has a monopoly on truth, and something that a bold insight can come from anywhere on the spectrum. So
I'm sorry, I flashed back to an old Simpsons episode where I wanted to say, well, actually, I wrote my thesis on the monopoly of truth. Sorry, go ahead.
I actually had forgotten all about that one. But Dan, it was great having our second throwdown on this topic.
Yes.
My thanks to all our Blogging Heads viewers, and best to everyone for the holidays. Thanks.
Yes, everyone have a happy new year, and may 2017 be better than 2016.